When God expelled man from the Garden of Eden, he placed cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the entrance. However, very few dare to ask the most unsettling question of what that door was truly meant to protect against. A barrier is never raised against nothingness, but against something that insists on crossing from the other side. And what if everything you were taught about the Garden of Eden was incomplete, hiding what truly lived outside? For centuries, it was repeated that beyond the garden, there was only empty land waiting to be inhabited one day. However, certain ancient texts describe a reality far stranger than what we imagine today. The Book of Enoch claims that those lands were not deserted, but populated by non-human beings. And what that man saw outside of Eden could forever change the way you read the entire Bible. There is a question that many scholars prefer never to voice aloud in front of others. Not because they ignore that the question exists, but because the answer disturbs everything we thought we knew. The question is simple yet profound. What truly inhabited the lands outside the Garden of Eden? Not within Eden, but outside, in the lands that stretched beyond those guarded doors. When God expelled Adam and Eve, the account states that he stationed cherubim to the east of the lost garden. Next to them, he placed a flaming sword that turned in every direction, guarding the way to the tree of life. Genesis states clearly that he expelled man and placed guardians to close access to the tree. Now, here arises the doubt that few dare to hold when reading that passage with true calmness. Why would God need such a level of supernatural protection if there was nothing to fear outside? A flaming sword, cherubim, a vigilance that never stops. This was not merely a divine ornament. It was a barrier, and barriers exist because something must remain outside or something must be contained. The Book of Enoch, one of the oldest and most explosive texts ever written, offers a horrifying answer. Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah and one of the most enigmatic figures in all Scripture, received something unique. He was taken through visions and journeys across lands that no other human being ever described like this. And what he beheld outside the limits of Eden was not an empty plain, but a territory inhabited by beings that were not human, creatures that existed long before Adam took his first breath. The Epistle of Jude cites Enoch directly, which surprises those who believed that book was marginal. There, it states that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about the judgment that the Lord would bring with his saints. The New Testament itself recognizes Enoch as a prophet, and that compels us to take his words seriously. His testimonies were not fantasy. They were considered for centuries as truly sacred testimony. Then the question returns with greater force. Who were those creatures, and what did they actually look like? And why has this part of the story been buried under centuries of carefully selective theology? The Book of Enoch opens a window that for a very long time the institutional church tried to keep closed. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, contained fragments of the Book of Enoch itself. This proved that it was not a medieval invention, but a text that already existed before the time of Christ. Entire communities preserved it, considering it sacred alongside the very Torah itself. What Enoch describes in those early chapters is not metaphor, but direct testimony of what he witnessed. And every testimony, no matter how uncomfortable it may be, demands at least that we pause for a moment to listen. The world before the flood was not a simple pastoral scene of primitive men learning to sow seeds. According to Enoch, it was a complex and terrifying spiritual landscape, much denser than we usually assume. A world where the boundary between the divine, the human, and something much darker was dangerously thin. Chapter 7 of Enoch describes the offspring of the Watchers, the fallen sons who descended. They were creatures of enormous size, beings of supernatural hunger and violence that devoured everything in their path. But long before the Nephilim were born, the earth already housed inhabitants that Enoch came to encounter. Beings situated in specific places, bound to precise functions, existing in a parallel reality. They were not demons in the vulgar sense we use that word today. They were something structured and organized. They had a defined purpose. Some were guardians, others were witnesses, and some, warns Enoch, fell. The letter to the Hebrews asks if they are not all angels, spirits sent to serve the faithful. But if some angels choose to serve, that implies that others, on the contrary, have chosen never to do so. And the territory outside of Eden was precisely where that choice had its most visible consequences. Here is what unsettles the attentive reader. God never claimed that the world outside of Eden was empty. What he said was that humanity was being removed from Eden, and that does not mean the same thing at all. The east of the garden was a specific geographical direction. The cherubim guarded a specific door, which implies that the rest of that ancient world was never described as an uninhabited region. The forests, the mountains, the deep valleys, none of that is presented as a deserted space. Enoch walked through those places, saw with his own eyes what dwelled there, and then wrote it down. If you were never taught this, you are not alone. Millions of sincere believers have never heard his name in a sermon. And that is extraordinary, because Enoch was taken to heaven without dying, something very rare in all Scripture. Genesis summarizes it with chilling sobriety. Enoch walked with God and then simply disappeared. Because God took him with him. He was not buried, he was not mourned by anyone. He was simply taken away. And God does not take someone away only to completely ignore everything that person came to witness. Enoch's visions are the testimony of a man so trusted by the divine that he evaded death entirely. His words deserve far more than the prolonged silence to which they have been condemned for centuries. To understand what Enoch saw outside of Eden, we must first understand who he was and why God chose him. Enoch was not a priest, he was not a king. He did not hold any official religious title in that early world. What distinguished him was something much simpler and yet much deeper. He walked with God. Genesis tells that after fathering Methuselah, Enoch faithfully walked with God for 300 years. 300 years of intimate and uninterrupted communion with the divine, a closeness we can hardly conceive. That kind of relationship produces a type of spiritual vision that most of us can barely imagine. And it was through that vision that Enoch began to perceive what others were incapable of contemplating. The Book of the Watchers, within Enoch, opens with him receiving visions of what lies beyond. He was taken in spirit, and the text suggests that sometimes also in body, to the ends of the earth. And in those remote places, he found creatures that defied every known category of the ancient world. The first thing Enoch describes upon approaching those outer territories is not darkness, but fire. A huge and living fire that did not consume what it touched, but illuminated that supernatural landscape. The text narrates it as a structure of crystal and flames, surrounded by fire that was warm, but did not burn. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is the language of a man trying to describe something real with few words. Beyond those flames, in the intermediate space between the known world and the divine, he saw something more. He saw beings stationed there with a purpose. They did not wander lost, but were firmly positioned. They were as if assigned to precise territories of the earth, including the regions to the east of Eden. And here the testimony becomes profoundly concrete, almost surgical in its description of those beings. Enoch describes certain creatures he calls watchers and carefully distinguishes between two lineages. On one side, the watchers who remained faithful, and on the other, those who chose to descend and corrupt themselves. The faithful ones were described as tall and luminous, with faces resembling the sun and eyes of ancient knowledge. They did not speak lightly. When they uttered a word, the earth itself seemed to respond instantly. The prophet Daniel references this same kind of being in one of his most famous night visions. There he recounts that he saw a holy being, a watcher, descending from heaven while he lay reclined on his bed. The watchers, therefore, are not exclusive to Enoch. They also appear within the canonical scripture itself. They are beings of divine oversight, assigned to watch over specific regions of all creation. And here arises the revelation that most teachers prefer to skip entirely without explanation. If the faithful watchers were watching over the earth, then they were watching over all of it, not just over Eden. The entire territory of the world before the flood was under their attentive and constant, silent observation, including, of course, any creatures that inhabited the lands extending outside the garden. Enoch affirms that the Great Holy One will leave his dwelling and the eternal God will walk upon the created earth. The divine was never confined to Eden. The divine moved throughout all creation, and its witnesses did too. So, what kind of creatures were those witnesses observing in the remote and exterior lands of the world? Enoch's descriptions are dense and, in certain passages, deeply disturbing for the reader. He speaks of beings bound in valleys, of enormous creatures chained beneath the earth, and of bodiless spirits, and of presences stationed at the limits of the created world since before the first human breath touched the ground. The Book of Jubilees, related to Enoch, and also found in Qumran, adds even more precise details. It describes how, in the earliest age of the world, certain spiritual beings were assigned to the earth, not as enemies at first, but as supervisors who coexisted alongside newly born humanity. Some were assigned to teach, others to guard, and some, over time, chose another path. The Book of Job offers an astonishing glimpse into that hidden reality behind the curtain of the visible world. It recounts that one day the heavenly beings presented themselves before the Lord, and among them came Satan. The Lord asked him where he had come from, and he replied that he had been roaming the earth and walking back and forth. Roaming the earth, going to and fro upon it. This is not the description of a being confined to a distant dimension. It is the description of a being that moves through the physical world, the same one that existed outside of Eden. What Enoch delivers to us, then, is not mythology. It is something much more concrete and much more unsettling. It is a map, a spiritual map of the world before the flood that was never an empty human stage. It was a populated kingdom inhabited by beings of different orders, different origins, and different loyalties. The creatures outside of Eden were real because the spiritual architecture of that world demanded their presence. A garden protected by cherubim and flaming swords could never exist suspended in absolute emptiness. It exists in contrast to something, Light only becomes visible when it is faced against darkness. A barrier only makes sense when something truly awaits on the other side to attempt to cross it. Scripture promises that God will command his angels to guard you in all your ways. But every guard implies a threat. No one protects another from nothing, but from a real lurking danger. The ancient world was a landscape of genuine spiritual danger, and Enoch entered it with his eyes wide open. He walked guided by the hand of God and returned to tell us exactly everything he came to witness. What he brought back is one of the most extraordinary spiritual documents in all of human history, and the precise descriptions he left of those outer creatures are precisely what we are examining now. The most disturbing aspect of what Enoch described is not the enormous size of those ancient beings. It is not their power, nor their fire, nor the ancient age they carried since before human creation. The most disturbing thing is how organized they were, because a chaotic creation leaves no mark whatsoever. What Enoch found outside the limits of Eden was not chaos, but a true spiritual structure, an infrastructure that was already in place long before Adam opened his eyes inside the garden. And that structure reveals something about God's creation that we were almost never taught to consider. Chapters 17 to 19 describe a journey that resembles nothing in ancient literature. Enoch is taken to the ends of the earth, to mountains of fire and rivers of unfathomable darkness, to places where the fabric separating the visible world from the invisible becomes impossibly thin. And in those sights, he contemplates beings that fulfill functions. They do not wander or bellow, but execute cosmic tasks. One of the most striking descriptions is that of the spirits of the angels who joined with women, a direct reference to the Watchers who fell and brought corruption to the entire world. But in those same passages, he also finds their opposites, beings of pure light at the created borders. Their entire existence was consecrated to witnessing and recording everything that happened in the lower physical world. The Apocalypse offers us an astonishing echo of that same reality in its vision of the throne and its creatures. It speaks of 4 living beings around the throne, covered with eyes in front and also behind. Covered with eyes, seeing absolutely everything in every possible direction without a single moment of rest. This is not a poetic adornment. It describes beings whose essential nature is total and uninterrupted awareness. The same quality that Enoch attributed to the faithful watchers stationed at the outer edges of the world. Now consider what this means for the territory that extended beyond the gates of Eden. When Adam and Eve were expelled, they did not walk into a wild land free of any watchful gaze. They walked into a realm already populated with spiritual presences, some faithful and others deeply fallen. All of them ancient, all of them conscious, all of them attentive to every step the newcomers took. The flaming sword at the door was not the only spiritual reality present in that vast ancient landscape. It was merely a point within an immense network of divine and corrupted presences spread across the earth. A network that extended throughout the entire pre-flood world, leaving no corner unmarked. Enoch's description of the fallen beings in those territories becomes truly overwhelming. He speaks of spirits that had abandoned their original form, beings that once were luminous, beings that once stood in the very presence of the divine, but chose to descend. And in that descent, they acquired characteristics that made them extremely dangerous to any human, especially for anyone who encountered them unprepared, unaware of what kind of presence they were dealing with. They were not creatures born evil. They were creatures that chose corruption, and that distinction matters. It matters greatly because it tells us that the world outside of Eden was not a place of random monsters. It was a place of fallen glory, of beings that once knew the face of God and then turned their backs. The prophet Isaiah speaks directly of that fall, asking how the morning star fell from heaven. He who was thrown to the earth, cast down, not created below, but hurled from the highest heights of heaven. The creatures outside of Eden were not primitive beings. They were ancient beings burdened with a terrible past. And an ancient and corrupted glory is much more dangerous than a mere newly born darkness. The Book of Enoch describes these fallen presences in physical terms that are hard to dismiss as allegory. They cast shadows, occupied real space, and Enoch speaks of their locations with astonishing geographical precision. Valleys, mountains, the most remote regions of the north, the deep places hidden beneath the solid ground. It was nothing vague or diffuse. It was the real physical landscape of the ancient world inhabited by those beings. Beings whose mere existence left marks upon the very earth, traces of a power that is hard for us to conceive. And here is what connects all of this directly with the most intimate history of primitive humanity. When Cain was banished after murdering Abel, the account states that he went away from the presence of the Lord. He went to live in the land of Nod, situated to the east of Eden, exactly the direction of the guarded door. Cain walked directly towards the territory where, according to Enoch, those ancient beings resided. And then, almost immediately, the text tells us something that has baffled scholars for centuries. It tells us that Cain knew his wife, and scholars have debated for generations where she came from. But Enoch's testimony suggests that the world to the east of Eden was not at all empty of life. It was inhabited, not necessarily by other humans as we imagine them, but by something more complex. By a world before the flood, much more populated than the genealogical tree of Genesis suggests. Genesis itself confirms that the situation eventually escalated in a truly dramatic way. When men began to multiply and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were beautiful. And they took wives for themselves from all whom they chose, mixing two orders that should never have united on earth. The sons of God, the Watchers, were already present in the world, already observing, already stationed. Their interaction with humanity set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the flood. It was not merely an act of divine punishment, but it became an act of true cosmic necessity. The Book of Enoch records the divine response to such widespread corruption throughout the created earth. The Lord commanded the archangel to proceed against the sons of fornication and destroy the lineage of the Watchers. That was not a small task of spiritual cleaning. It was the removal of an entire order of corrupt creation. An order that had spread across the earth like a spiritual infection, impossible to stop. The creatures that Enoch described outside of Eden were real, and not because myths were needed to explain them. Not because ancient peoples needed legends to make sense of the unknown surrounding them, but because the biblical narrative itself only makes full sense when we understand what that lost world was like. A world before the flood that was a genuinely populated spiritual landscape filled with ancient presences. The flood did not merely purify the human sin that had accumulated upon the face of the earth. It purified a world that had been altered at its root by the presence and corruption of very powerful beings. Beings much older and much stronger than any man who has ever breathed upon the planet. And yet, in the midst of all that, Enoch walked through every corner of that terrifying world. He saw every corner of that ancient land and returned alive to deliver us his complete and accurate testimony. His mere survival is proof that divine protection is stronger than any created darkness, stronger than any shadow that has ever lurked on the other side of the sealed doors of Eden. There is a detail that almost everyone overlooks when reading how the Watchers interacted with men. The Book of Enoch states that those beings not only descended, but also taught forbidden secrets. They revealed to humanity the art of forging metals, of making weapons, and of cutting the earth with iron. They taught women enchantments, poisonous roots, and the dark knowledge of distant stars. What once belonged only to heaven was thrown into human hands that were not prepared to hold it. And thus, the knowledge that was meant to elevate man became a weapon that accelerated his own corruption. From those forbidden unions were born giants, creatures of a stature that terrified the earth. Their hunger was insatiable. First, they devoured the harvests, then the flocks, and finally, the very men themselves. When nothing was left to satisfy them, they began to turn against each other in unrestrained violence. The spilled blood soaked the ground, and the cry of the wounded earth began to rise to the very heavens. Enoch recounts that the souls of the dead cried out without rest, pleading for justice before the throne of the Most High. And that cry did not go unanswered. The faithful archangels brought the plea before the divine presence. It was then that heaven decided to intervene and put an end to the corrupted order that was devouring creation. But before the final judgment, Enoch was shown the fate reserved for the fallen Watchers. He beheld a desolate and burning place, a prison prepared for the spirits that betrayed their origin. He saw bottomless abysses, columns of fire rising high, and precipices that no eye could measure. There, they were told, the stars and the rebellious powers would remain bound until the day of final judgment. It was not an improvised punishment, but a sentence written before the world knew the first light. Enoch describes that those beings begged for mercy and asked him to intercede for them before God. But when he brought their plea to heaven, the response was blunt. For them, there would be no peace or forgiveness. They had abandoned the eternal heights for a moment of desire, and the price of that descent was irreversible. This is the deepest warning that Enoch's testimony leaves engraved for all future generations. That even the most luminous beings can fall when they choose desire over the purpose they were given. And that the boundary between glory and ruin is not measured in power, but in the faithfulness sustained over time. The landscape that Enoch traversed was therefore not merely geography. It was a moral map of the soul of all creation. Every mountain of fire, every chained valley spoke of a choice, of a loyalty kept or betrayed. That is why his account disturbs. It reveals not distant monsters, but the echo of grave, eternal decisions. And that is why the early church feared this text so much, because it forces us to face what we prefer not to see. That the world from its origin was a battleground between the light that serves and the glory that chose to fall. Enoch saw it all, endured it, and returned, and his voice traverses millennia to remind us of what was outside. Those creatures were not a dream or a legend. They were the real shadow that gave meaning to the flaming sword. And understanding their existence is perhaps understanding finally why that door had to be closed forever. That flaming sword did not guard an empty garden. It guarded the boundary of a world full of fallen glory. Subscribe now to continue discovering the mysteries that history and sacred texts still hide.